framework for how I'm thinking about what I'm doing. And I'm coming at this from a teacher-educator's perspective, from a designer of curriculum for teacher learning, not from can I figure out what PCK is. So I'm more using the PCK. And I'm looking at learning progressions because I want to think about how teachers get more sophisticated in how they think about teaching over a long period of time. So while some of my work is actually in a pre-service year, I'm interested in following them into the next year. I've worked with teachers in mid-career, and so I'm thinking of it very broadly, as in like 10 years. So I'm using learning progressions, and I'm using PCK as a heuristic, just to have something to trace what is going on as you go across such a large span of time. And within this framework, I'm using the PCK specifically to design a program, and I can talk more about that, but it's beyond the scope of what we're doing here. A program that is a one-year graduate program to take people who are not from teaching into teaching in 1 year, and is closely tied with the classroom. And we're really working on how you make that designed around progressing their thinking as they go across that year. And so I have to figure out what am I going to design it around, and how will I know if then they've actually progressed. So I'm using PCK for that purpose. Part of the work that I'm going to talk about here was a review of the literature. So if I want to start thinking about progressions, well, let's look at what all the work that's been done in the last 20 years and see if we could trace some kind of progression across that time. So I'm looking at trajectories. And I will tell you that the trajectory, what I'm thinking in my head, is towards more sophisticated thinking, towards expertise. And because I'm a teacher educator preparing teachers to teach who knows where, I have to have something that is transferable. So it's a little broader than topic specific, even though I agree that that's where the teachers will learn it in a topic, but as the educator and designer, I have to think about it up a level. So I'm looking at trajectories broadly across categories through the review of the literature to see what we could do, and now keep in mind it's over 20 years and all the teachers are different. So you can't say anything about any particular teacher's progress through that. And then I'm looking at it more focused with particular teachers through our pre-service program, which will then continue on into the next year so that I can redesign our program and see if we get more progress. And I will tell you that we're in the third year of this cohort, just starting the third year, and we are taking information from last year, looking at this progression, and changing the order of some of the ideas, and it seems to be helpful. I have to look at that data from this year, obviously, because we're 3 months in, but we are already feels like we are progressing more quickly than we did last year, and it's making sense to the teachers. So there's some good anecdotal hints that it's going to be a good idea to think about this. In particular, I'm looking at sequence, the important ideas to emphasize and when, and which ideas get connected to other ideas for the learners, which in this case are the teachers. Okay, so I'm not going to go over all of these, but I use an inclusive approach. I wanted to see if I could find it anywhere. So I looked at all the categories that had been described and the categories people actually used in their research. And so this is a comprehensive list, not a suggestion that this should be the model. And there were trajectories, and I will talk a little bit in a couple of slides about which ones were more robust and which ones were lacking. But here's an example of the kind of thing that came out of that work. Looking across all of the review, we can see, and you can see that it was in science, and you can see, I'm using the word science, but it sounds not topic specific. But keep in mind, I got it from the data that the researchers were doing. It was topic specific. So even though they were in different topics, I was looking for this pattern across, and this is what comes out. Suggested by our pre-service cohort, and this is still very early, and what it is looking like is going to turn out is I might have a little more detail around a narrower band. So that's where we're at with that. But I wanted to focus not so much on the progressions, but on some of the things that we had been thinking about this week. And one of the questions we asked were about the categories of PCK, what's in, what's out, what works, what doesn't. And looking for trajectories and looking across the research, we can see that there were some areas that were not represented. And partially that's because at that time and that place, it wasn't part of the instruction. And so it wasn't then measured for the outcomes. So this is tied to what people's research agendas were, their instructional agendas. So these four were not as well represented. Work on instructional strategies in particular, and I'll show you the instructional strategy section there. All of those didn't focus consistently across the group. They tended to focus on action. Did teachers do it? Rather than thinking as much about how student thinking is supported and when to use and how to make decisions. Assessment was another one that focused on actions. Over 20 years, you get changes in agendas. For example, the phrasing went from misconceptions to alternative to naive to prior conceptions over time. And so there's a shift in what was important for folks. And also the early PCK work, when you look at that, it's not as well defined. We feel somewhat undefined now. Go back 20 years and read that stuff, and it's way more undefined. Yes, it does. So I color-coded, this is the chart that I showed you a minute ago. Some things that came out of trying to find trajectories. In particular, under orientations, and this is what people declared as orientations. Actually, in order to get a trajectory, I had to split goals and purpose. And so those actually came apart as two separate trajectories. The blue ones over here, these actually collapsed. It wasn't possible to get separate trajectories for each of those things, so those things were clustered. The red ones are underrepresented, so, and I mentioned those on the other slide, things that we didn't have as much of, but the bold ones were so underrepresented, I couldn't get a trajectory for them. Okay, so I couldn't suggest anything about what teachers, how they develop understanding of what's appropriate for their students to understand at this time, at this grade level. Science phenomena didn't actually come out to be a trajectory. Even though there's work there, there wasn't enough to show that teachers went from this idea to thinking about it this way to thinking about it in another way. Interesting, there was a whole, bunch of work under this general student-centered stuff. Not that helpful. It turned out to not be helpful. I could make a trajectory for it, but it still feels unconnected to science, and it was confounded with inquiry. So people weren't making that distinction. And a part of that was in the earlier work. And assessment. In assessment, I know we talked about whether or not that's in or out. I will tell you that most folks who are thinking about instructions for teachers didn't include it as something to learn about in science. But some did, and this was the only category of all of the categories that I looked at where there were more studies looking at teacher leaders, experienced teachers, than there were early stage teachers. So I will tell you that a lot of work is done in the early stages, or in our methods course, we can do this, as opposed to later on. But when we did look at these, one thing I can say that looking at this as a heuristic, I couldn't make trajectories until I got down a notch to those subcategories. The top level categories weren't helpful. There were connections. In particular, the views of science and learning were very much connected to their ideas about student thinking. Those two really worked together, which leads you to think about how can we teach it to teachers in a way that it leverages off of both of those. Those operated together. Another one that operated together is expressing ideas and assessment. So even though we categorized assessing or thinking about their ideas, how they express them over here, and assessment over here, for teachers, these actually worked together. And the other one was challenging ideas and the phenomenal strategies. seemed like natural here. So as an educator, I'm thinking, which things should I teach at the same time in the same case? If I'm going to make cases, what features should I think about together? And I think I've said a little bit of this. As a heuristic, for what I'm doing, for designing instruction over this range of time, it wasn't as helpful to be topic specific as it was to go up a notch and take something, what we know about all those topic specific things, and say, how do they progress in their ideas that may be useful in other topics. Now, I would say that if I'm teaching methods, I would still teach it in a topic. But I, as the educator, would know that I'm thinking about it. How am I going to make sure that they're learning the things that will pay off for them in the next topic? And thoughts about next steps, specifically things that I'm looking at, but would be interesting for us as a group. Because instruction is so closely related to whether or not teachers develop PCK, and that was another thing that came out of this work. If we haven't had instruction on it, do we really know if teachers can learn it? And so in order to look for it and measure the PCK, we might have to actually first have some instruction on it, and then measure it and find out what we didn't know, and then redesign our instruction. So it feels like we have to attend to both of those issues back and forth. I would emphasize thinking about what teachers think about what they do. And it feels like both of those pieces need to be there explicitly, and they're not always. There were a lot of work that was worried about what teachers do, and then perhaps other work that's worried about what they think, but it's what do they think about what they are doing. It seems to be helpful. And I mentioned a little bit interaction of the components. There's some interesting places to think about how those things play off of each other. Thinking back to one of the comments that Lee Schulman said on the first day, that law school has a curriculum, med school has a curriculum, and I'll tell you, my daughter, we shopped law schools, and so I got to go around and look at the curriculum of a lot of other schools. They know what they're doing. I mean, they may be right or wrong, but all of them were on the same curriculum. They know what their plan is. And I can't say that we're not actually that sure in education, that we don't have a curriculum across careers. And looking at the work I've seen, there will be workshops here or intervention there, but there's really not a curriculum that is going to help teachers progress in a specific way. And mid-career teachers are lost in all of this. They get bundled in with all the other teachers. We have pre-service, and we may have some stuff on leader teachers, and then we have everybody else who came to the workshop. And separating them specifically by years of experience may or may not be helpful, but we don't do that, so I don't know. Because there were teachers in these samples who thought like first-year teachers, regardless of their years of experience. So it's more of a how far are you along the progression rather than how many years of experience you have. But there's something in that mid-career we need to think about. That's it.
Thank you.